without a Democrat-led Senate since 1884. So that's a huge check on the policy agenda. And there's actually a parlor game in Washington that Biden that in some ways Biden might actually see that as an advantage because the Democratic Party right now is, and we'll talk more about this, but the Democratic Party right now is really divided between the far left progressives who want to use this to, push Green New Deal and all kinds of very progressive appointments, and Biden's background, Biden's genetics are more as a moderate, more as a deal maker, an institutionalist, and that sort of thing. So the fact that he does have to deal with a Republican Senate for making his cabinet appointments may give him the excuse to go back to this progressive wing of his party and say, look, I'm going to put these people in those cabinet positions rather than the ones you want because I can't get the ones you want confirmed in the Senate. Now, that's not stopping the debate from happening. A lot of environmental groups, don't know if you've heard of some of these, but Sunrise Movement and a few others, they have published lists of who they want to see in the cabinet positions. And it's Elizabeth Warren for Treasury Secretary and Bernie Sanders for Labor, and very liberal choices. And every time a name gets floated that's not on that progressive list, that left wing of the Democratic Party is going nuts and demanding this sort of attention. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. As one example that applies directly to us is Ernest Moniz's name was floated for Energy Secretary. Now, Ernest Moniz, you'll remember him. He's the one with the crazy hair who was Energy Secretary during the Obama administration. Well, the idea was floated, well, let's bring him back. That progressive wing went nuts. No, you can't have him. He was he favored all of the above energy choices, and he was on the board at Southern Company, and we can't have fossil fuels people on there, and that sort of thing. They're trying to push Biden not to appoint anybody who's ever received a nickel of fossil fuel money ever, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So I stole this slide from Bruce Melman, who we put him in the on track, and you see he does these great slide decks that sort of analyze the big picture of where politics are going, and this is really well what's going to happen now given this. There's a case that the fact that you've got this balance of power in a Republican Senate could lead to some things actually happening in 21. I mean, if you add up Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Mitch McConnell, you've got 113 years of deal making experience as legislators. They are deal makers by nature. They've got reasons to do deals with the COVID crisis and economic recovery. The moderates in both of their parties want to see progress on some of these things. The Republicans in the Senate, that little map down in the corner there shows that the Republicans in the Senate are also concerned about holding on to their majority in the midterm elections that are coming up in 2 years. There's a lot more red states to defend in 2 years to hold on to that Republican control in the Senate, and they're not going to want to do things that put those seats at risk. And certain of the media will praise deal making and compromise in the new environment after the more contentious 4 years we've just been through. That's the optimistic case. The pessimistic case says, you've got the far wings of both parties. We talked already about the progressives on the Democratic side. You've also got conservatives on the Republican side who don't want to compromise. They just want to run their agenda. The pandemic has become partisan. How to approach these economic issues has become partisan, and the ideologues want purity. I've already told you, whenever Biden's camp floats a moderate name for a cabinet appointment or another position, his progressive wing goes nuts on him. And the Democratic, again, this is a very narrow Democratic majority now in the House, and that's at risk in 2 years for the Democrats. And there's a huge debate going on in the House now with the moderate Democrats saying, look, guys, you've got to stop saying defund the police. You've got to stop saying socialism, where we can't hold on to our majority like that. And the progressive wing firing back, saying, "Yeah, well, you've been doing such a good job. No, we need to go all the way toward these things." So, and then social media. Again, some of you have heard me say this, but you need to go watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. Uh, Netflix, The Social Dilemma. It's a documentary. It's former Facebook and Google guys talking about how social media has become a threat to our democracy, because it just pulls people down into their respective rabbit holes and doesn't allow for talk. And so we can expect the social media sphere to not be supportive of compromise. It's going to continue to try to push people to the extremes. So how do you evaluate where we go from here? Um, there's a phrase, personnel is policy. In the near term, between now and the inauguration, between now and the inauguration, really, and then the first 100 days of the new administration, pay attention to who's getting appointed to the executive branch jobs, because that's where the real those are the people who are going to write the rules, who are going to implement the policies. That'll tell us where things are going. So, as an example, early speculation on the EPA administrator. The two apparently leading candidates for EPA administrator are Mary Nichols. Mary Nichols is the longtime head of the California Air Resources Board, who's already announced she's retiring at the end of the year. All that stuff you see coming out of California, that's got Mary Nichols' fingerprints on it. Cap and trade, carbon, zero fossil fuels by 2030, those kind of things. She's a favorite of a lot of the progressive groups. She would be tough to get through the Senate. The second bold one I did there, Heather McAteer Toney, she's a former regional EPA administrator under Obama. She would be easier to get through Republican Senate because she's been in the role before. Still not a friend of the coal industry, and in all the news that she's been putting out has been really focused on environmental justice issues. We'll talk more about that later. You look at the other likely candidates. People who are the National Wildlife Federation, former regulators, at least one senator, a couple former governors. We'll see how that shorts out. The first cabinet appointments are probably coming soon. They may be made around Thanksgiving, either right before or right after, and we'll see a bunch of other announcements through December. So we'll get a feel for this pretty early. The other clue that you can look at is the transition teams. So there's a link there if you're really interested. But Biden has already announced his transition teams. These are groups of people, volunteers, who go into every department and scope out what's going on and start coming up with plans for how the transition is going to happen. And the thing about transition teams is often a lot of the people who are on those transition teams end up filling a lot of the senior political spots in the agencies that they're reviewing. So, paying attention to them is also instructive. So the EPA transition team, the transition team for EPA, all right, we talked about how it might be an advantage for Biden. He could be more moderate because he's got to get cabinet officials appointed by a Republican Senate. But the character of his transition teams are not exactly moderate. This is the transition team for EPA. The head of it is with Earth Justice, has spent time at Natural Resources Defense Council, all that kind of stuff. Now, Patrice Sims, he's also a former EPA official. He's got a solid regulatory background. He's competent. He knows what he's doing. But look down the rest of the list there. You've got Earth Justice, you've got NRDC, you've got Sierra Club, Grist magazine, which if you haven't seen it is about as far left, environmental magazine as you can get. And then you got 5 different people who were former Obama era EPA officials. So at best, you're going to get an Obama era kind of an EPA approach to this. At worst, you could be getting something left of that, given this group of transition people. Notably, there is no expertise from the regulated community there. You don't see a single corporate person. You don't see a single lawyer who has represented corporate interests and that kind of stuff. The regulated community is completely absent from that list. Let's look at a couple of other agency transition teams that are out there. The Department of Energy. no fossil fuels, no fossil. It's a little less environmental groupie. It's more academic. A lot of professors and people from academia, but zero fossil fuels representation, zero nuclear representation, and the nuclear part is significant. I don't know if you know this, but probably 3/4 of the Department of Energy's budget and activities are centered around managing our nuclear stockpiles, not just nuclear power plants. The Department of Energy is also in charge of managing the nuclear stockpile for all the weapons and the materials production and that kind of thing. Nobody with nuclear expertise on this transition list. And on the Department of Transportation, and I know Ann is going to talk more about this in her presentation, but that group is heavy with public transit entities, labor unions. There is no railroad representation on there. There's no shipper representation in there. There's no road builder representation in there. So from a transition team's point of view, this is a pretty liberal trajectory for right now. So what's he going to do? What's Biden going to do when he comes in? Well, I divided into there's easy stuff and then there's harder stuff. The easy stuff. Get ready for the announcement. He's going to rejoin the Paris Accords on day one. That'll be a big signing thing. We're going to be back in the world climate change debates. He's probably going to organize a global summit on climate change, try to push the United States back into a leadership position on climate action. Expect over the first 100 days, President Trump was very active in issuing executive orders to drive decision making within the initial agencies. I think we can expect, what can be done through executive order can be undone through executive order. So I think we can expect President Biden to undo all of President Trump's executive orders and then replace them with executive orders of its own. Some of those executive orders that Biden will do will have a direct impact on our industry. Get ready for an executive order ordering every agency to consider climate change in all of its rulemakings and all of its activities. There's also talk now of executive orders requiring all agencies to consider environmental justice aspects in all of their rulemakings and activities. And for those of you who might not be familiar with their term, environmental justice refers to the fact that industrial facilities or regulated entities like power plants tend to be surrounded by less advantaged communities. And so, what are all the regulatory things you can do to correct that or compensate for that or so forth? So that's the easy stuff. That's stuff you can do by the stroke of the pen. The harder stuff would be actually changing regulations that the Trump administration got in place. And this will happen two ways. One, they could approach and try to roll back the rollbacks. Okay, let's take the Clean Power Plan, for instance. The Obama era put in a set of climate regulations. Trump came in, replaced those with the ACE rule. This administration could come undo that and go back towards something like what Obama had. The thing is, if it was put in, if it's done by executive order, it can be undone by executive order. If it was done by rulemaking, it needs to be undone by rulemaking. And that's a time-consuming, laborious process, proposals, public comments, making things stand up in court, the inevitable litigation that follows. And there's this huge list of priorities. So how an EPA, for instance, decides to prioritize all of those things that need to be done will be instructive. And I think they'll go at the big ticket items, the clean, the carbon regulations, that kind of stuff first. So I think we'll see a lot of that, but it will take time. It'll take just like it took the whole 4 years of Trump's administration, it'll take the whole 4 years of Biden's first term to undo that stuff. Now, the second bullet there, though, is maybe even more dangerous for the regulated community like us, and that is they can do agency guidance on specific regulations. So there's a lot of regulations that Trump has changed and has gotten in place now, but the agencies who are now driving the enforcement of those regulations can issue guidance that changes how it gets implemented. And I think you'll see a lot of that. And one of the things to really watch for is a very popular tactic back in the Obama area was something called sue and settle, where the environmentalists would file a lawsuit that the EPA would, perceive friendly, and then they would get together on the side and they would come up with a consent decree to settle the lawsuit and actually do policy that way. It's a bad way to do policy. It takes out that whole public comment part. It presents real problems, but we could see a return to that kind of sue and settle approach to changing some of these regulations and twisting them around the side. So what's going to happen up on Capitol Hill? A little bit different story. You may have heard about the Congressional Review Act, which is where Congress can just come in and undo any of these regulations that Trump did in the last 100 legislative days of his term. That's not likely to happen. To do that, you've got to have agreement from both houses of Congress. And as long as the Republicans hold the Senate, I don't think you're going to see the Congressional Review Act coming into play. If the Democrats win those 2 Georgia seats, I'll eat my words and we'll come back and we'll have another webinar about the Congressional Review Act. But for now, it doesn't look like that's going to come into play. What Congress will focus on is probably efforts that can pass the Senate. Now, make no mistake, in the first 100 days, you're going to see the House pass all kinds of bills that are message bills that will throw their stake out there. There will be a lot of that kind of activity. But once things settle down, what the focus will really be on is what are things that they can get done that they can actually get through the Senate also. So, there's probably going to be more talk about COVID relief bills. Areas in the energy and environment sphere where there's compromise possible, there's tax credit policy. The Democrats can get more of the tax policy that they want for renewables if they throw the Republicans a bone on things like Section 45Q for carbon sequestration tax credit, things that can help fossil fuels. And then the big holy grail of compromise that's been around forever, but has a hard time coming out, is infrastructure. But if the left side of Bruce Mehlman's slide happens and we're in a cooperative mood and things start to go, infrastructure investment is lines up nicely with economic incentives for COVID relief, and we could see a lot of activity in that area. Oversight will be key. So the Senate now, for the past 4 years, the House has had the oversight role of being able to have hearings and issue reports and all this kind of stuff to take shots at what the administration is doing. That is now going to shift over to the Senate. Expect the Republican-led Senate committees now to start being the ones who are issuing reports and conducting investigations and having oversight hearings to try to pick apart what these new Biden appointees are doing. Now, House oversight is also likely to continue, but it'll be in a way that's more friendly to the Biden administration. And for what we're talking about for the Coal Transportation Association, that the House Democrats have actually been more sympathetic to shippers than the Republican side, who tends to align more with the railroads. So I'll leave that and let Ann talk a little bit more about that dynamic that may come into play. Before I turn it over to Ann, a little shameless self-promotion here. Can't get away without an NCTA commercial. We got one more webinar on tap this year. For those of you who are in the O&M space, on December 3rd, we're having a webinar on private car management, damaged cars, how to deal with them, negotiations, all that kind of stuff. And then please mark your calendars for our conferences next spring. We're planning that these are going to move forward in an in-person format. We will have some virtual attendance options on these that we learned how to do with our 2 conferences that we pulled off this year. But we do hope to be able to get back together. So very attractive places. Our spring conference in Napa Valley. The O&M conference will be down in Point Clear, Alabama in June. And then our 47th annual business meeting and conference next fall will be back in Phoenix, Arizona. So we've put out some discounted conference sponsorship advertising packages. They're available now. Watch the on track for those. They're also on the website. Call Melinda. We'll make you a deal if you commit to some of these things before the end of the year here. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my slides. Ann, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Great. I am sorry. I don't know what happened. Zoom would not let me access, and I was on a Zoom virtual meeting at 10, and it was fine. So I apologize.
No worries. I'll share your slides and you can talk through them that way. How's that?
That'll work great. Just let me know when you're ready.
They are up now. So introduced you earlier. Take it away, Ann. Give us a little more insight on the transportation side.
Great. Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I can't see you, but hopefully I can see you all next time we're together. Thank you for the invitation, and I am also very excited that NCTA has been a client of mine since the beginning of the year, so I appreciate working with you in that capacity also. I just want to focus on, I'll start with the U.S. transportation policy and the Biden administration. So John, if you could switch to slide 2.
So,
John kind of outlined a little bit about where we are with the transition teams and what their function is. And I would highlight also, in addition to what John shared, this U.S. transportation policy team, these folks are former Obama officials, Clinton officials, former Biden officials in his different capacities of public service over the years. A lot is focused on all the transportation on demand, academia, technology, industry leaders. And as John noted, there are no shippers, no railroads, no truckers, no aviation, no architectural engineering, design, or construction viewpoints represented in the transition team. And I would add that I haven't heard too much in terms of rumors about who might be under consideration to serve as U.S. DOT Secretary. But in addition to looking to some of the names that are already on this transition team, the latest rumor I heard, and don't laugh, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. Oftentimes the U.S. DOT Secretary position is one of those cabinet positions that can be filled or seems to be filled by an individual of the opposite party. We saw that under Bush 43, and we did see that under Obama. So that was just the latest rumor. I don't really know if I have too much confidence in that, but that's what I know as of now in terms of rumors. I would say that it is pretty well understood that President-elect Biden, he does have a strong infrastructure emphasis. He always has. However, when we look at his infrastructure emphasis in NCTA space, he's really more focused on transit and commuter rail policy and funding rather than freight policy or freight rail funding. So that's something that we all are just going to have to keep attuned to moving forward as his administration fills out and as Congress begins its work in the new year. So John, if you want to turn to the next slide for transportation policy under the Surface Transportation Board. Particularly for NCTA, this is the independent agency that NCTA deals the most with in terms of transportation. Right now, we have an STB board configuration of 3 members. The current chairman, Ann Begeman, who is a Republican nominee, her second term actually expires this December 31st, and there is no indication that she has requested a 1-year holdover term, nor has there been any indication that the Biden administration would be interested in perhaps having her serve in a 1-year holdover capacity. So that leaves us with current Vice Chairman Martin Oberman, who is a Democrat, and then Patrick Fuchs, who is a Republican member on the board. However, last night around the dinner hour, surprise, surprise, the U.S. Senate did confirm the two nominees for the Surface Transportation Board, rounding the Surface Transportation Board to 5 people, as was allowed for in the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act of 2015. So they did confirm Robert Primus, who is the Democratic slot, and they confirmed Michelle Schultz, who's the Republican slot. I'm pretty sure that their confirmation and their swearing-in ceremonies will be held pretty soon. So at least for about a month or so, we can comfortably say that the STB will have a full complement of 5 board members, which is something that shippers have been advocating for even before the Reauthorization Act of 2015. It will be interesting to see what the Biden administration will do, whether or not they'll appoint Martin Oberman as the chairman or an acting chairman until they figure out and nominate another Democrat to fill that 5th spot beginning for next year. We do know that regardless of the change in the change administration, the priorities for the STB will remain the same. Basically, it continues to be focused on implementing the recommendations that were put forth in its rate review task force. This focuses on issues such as market dominance, revenue adequacy, and the final offer rate review. They're also going to be continuing to keep an eye on demurrage and accessory charges, the problems that shippers have been experiencing, and some shippers still are experiencing problems in that area. And the STB will continue to have a focus on the impacts to shippers relative to railroad operational changes such as PSR. And I would note that NCTA, you all played a pivotal role, especially with Emily's participation in various STB hearings that were held during the past couple of years, informal meetings with STB, and also the on-time performance data metrics survey that you all did that Emily presented during a recent RETAC meeting of the STB. So you all have been engaged and it's been making a difference, and I do trust that you all will continue to be engaged moving forward. With that said, with the STB, I do want to highlight that NCTA joined FRCA, Freight Rail Customer Alliance, National Industrial Transportation League, and the Private Rail Food and Beverage Association, CAR Association. We all submitted a joint letter of concern to the STB at the end of August, asking that the STB provide or require the rail carriers to submit in the aggregate data regarding last mile, first mile performance. And we're still not quite sure how the STB is going to be handling that request. But we do know that the STB members are very appreciative of our joint trade group submitting such a letter. They're taking it very seriously. And I think the issue is whether or not STB can move forward with that activity without a formal rulemaking. So I think we're just kind of in a holding pattern trying to see what they're going to be doing with that. So John, if you want to go to slide 4 for transportation policy in the Senate. Just if you can just kind of remember what John talked about in terms of the overall umbrella as to what's happening in the Senate regarding the post-election changes. As John noted, we really won't know who's the majority or minority in the Senate until after the January 5th runoffs in Georgia. At the beginning of a new Congress, the committee ratios, the numbers of Republicans and Democrats that sit on the committees always changes to reflect the outcome of the preceding election. It remains unclear if those ratios will change that much for the new Congress, given how tight this election was and continues to be with the Georgia situation. In terms of transportation policy, there are 3 committees in the Senate that have jurisdiction over transportation matters. The first is the Banking, Housing, and Urban Development Committee, and that basically focuses on mass transit. You can note in the slide what the changes are there. The key policy committee for NCTA and its members is the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. It has the jurisdiction over freight rail. The current chairman, Roger Wicker from Mississippi, will remain the chairman moving forward. He tends to be a little bit more pro-railroad than aligning with the shippers. However, he does tend to have a sympathetic to the small shipper community, particularly agricultural interests. For the Democratic side, the current ranking member will remain Maria Cantwell from Washington. She can have a more sympathetic ear to the shipper point of view. However, she is in line to be the chairman for the Indian Affairs Committee. So if she decides to move to that committee, the next in line would be Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. And she's always been a very strong supporter of removing the antitrust exemptions that the railroad industry currently enjoys. However, she is next in line to be chairman for the Rules Committee. So it's still kind of up in the air as to where the leadership of that full committee will rest starting in January. The subcommittee, which really is the nexus for the surface transportation policy initiatives, the chair will remain Senator Deb Fischer from Nebraska. She is sympathetic to the shipper point of view. However, in her home state of Nebraska is BNSF headquarters, and also UP has a strong presence in Nebraska. So sometimes there's a bit of a conflict between railroad interests and shipper interests from her standpoint. The ranking member will continue to be Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois. And of course, she is primarily interested in the Chicago area, the congestion that does happen, especially with freight rail shippers, and how it impacts the rest of the nation. For the Appropriations Committee, it looks like that Chairman Richard Shelby from Alabama will remain, and also Ranking Member Patrick Leahy from Vermont will remain as well. And considering that Senator Senator Leahy from Vermont, and it looks like that Senator Collins will remain the chairman of the Transportation Subcommittee, especially since she won a very difficult reelection in her home state of Maine. And the Democrat member on that subcommittee is probably going to remain the same, which is Jack Reed from Rhode Island. So John, if you could go to slide 5 for the same picture for the U.S. House of Representatives. I think what's really interesting is that, as John mentioned, the Democrats lost seats in the House, which was a total surprise. As such, Pelosi and the Democratic leadership, they have very little room to maneuver in terms of trying to advance some of the policy agendas, especially as portrayed by the progressive wing of that party. What is interesting is that Pelosi has been urging all Democrats in the House not to take positions in the administration to help protect the majority that is there in the House moving forward. That is really telling. And I did find it extremely interesting that just a couple of days ago, a Congressman, Cedric Richmond from the New Orleans area, he actually announced his retirement from the House, and he's going to be joining the Biden administration in a capacity in the White House. So I thought that was interesting that soon after she makes this announcement, one of her members defects to go to the Biden administration. So you just never know. The committees, the ratio of the committees are going to change a little bit because the Democrats lost so many seats. I'm just not too sure what those numbers will be when all is said and done in January. Sometimes finalizing the committee rosters doesn't really happen until March. So we'll just kind of have to see how this all plays out. The main committee in the House for all infrastructure is just one committee, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Representative Peter DeFazio from Oregon, he will remain chairman. He won an extremely difficult re-election in his home state of Oregon. So he squeaked that out, so he will remain as chairman. Ranking member Sam Graves from Missouri, he will remain as ranking member. The key subcommittee here is the Railroad Subcommittee, and Representative Dan Lipinski, he lost his primary race. So there are two members that are actively campaigning for this slot, Congressman Donald Payne from New Jersey and Congressman Albo Ciris also from New Jersey. I will say, as what John noted earlier, the House Railroad Subcommittee under the Democratic leadership has done yeoman's work as it relates to trying to have Congress address railroad shipper concerns. And we're just hoping that path will continue under new leadership of this subcommittee. One of the reasons why you have two Democratic members vying for chairmanship is there's a huge transit project in the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Washington, D.C. with Union Station. That's called the Gateway Project, and the Trump administration has blocked funding for that. So that's one of the reasons why you see all this interest from New Jersey to have this chairmanship spot. The ranking member for the subcommittee is Rick Crawford. However, he is seeking to be chairman of the full Agricultural Committee. If that happens, the next in line to serve as ranking member would be Scott Perry from Pennsylvania. As with the Senate, the Appropriations Committee, we do have a major change with the chairman, as Nita Lowy is retiring. We have three people who are actively campaigning to fill the chairmanship spot, and that's Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut, Marcy Campter from Ohio, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida. The ranking member will remain the same, which is Kay Granger of Texas. The Transportation Subcommittee slots will remain the same, with Congressman David Price from North Carolina chairing it, and he always has had a sympathetic ear to shippers, as well as the ranking member, Congressman Diaz-Balart from Florida, and he has always had a sympathetic ear to rail shippers as well. So John, if we can go to the next slide, number 6, which is transportation policy of during the lame duck. The big issue is that the continuing resolution, which is keeping the federal government running at basically FY 2020 funding levels, expires December the 11th. The House passed its various measures of an FY 2021 appropriation packages. The Senate just released its draft versions of 12 FY 2021 appropriation packages. I should say that there's no intent from the Senate leadership to bring any of those 12 bills to the Senate floor for consideration. In an essence of time, they were released as markers to begin the negotiation with the House and House leaders on reaching a final FY 2021 appropriation package or packages for the remainder of the year. And again, the fiscal year 2021 actually began October 1st. What is of interest to NCTA members in the transportation space is both the House passed measure and the draft measure introduced by the Senate Appropriations Committee. They both provide record level funding for the STB at $37.5 million. This level was recommended by the Trump budget. It basically covers some cost of living adjustments and hiring of new staff. And it was actively supported by FRA. There's also various report language that addresses congressional concerns regarding a greater utilization of cost-benefit analysis by the STB, expressing that timeliness of proceedings expressing concerns about delays in moving forward with rulemakings, and also is stating the need for a full complement of board members. Well, that one they can cross off the list for the final package. We do expect Senator Tammy Baldwin to introduce her Rail Shipper Fairness Act of 2020. This measure she does every Congress. It basically can be used as a vehicle for an STB reauthorization bill. But this bill, she just kind of wants to get a marker out for the next Congress. And again, I just mentioned the confirmations of Robert Primus and Michelle Schultz are final. Transportation policy for the 117th Congress for both the House and the Senate. Everything is FAST Act reauthorization. Everything is going to be focused on this measure. This is the measure that provides the authorization for federal funding for our highway, our mass transit systems, our passenger rail systems, and all the various safety regulations and requirements for highways, roads, bridges, tunnels, truckers, railroads. There is an extension, a one-year extension. For now, this measure expires September 30th, 2021. The House over the summer did pass its Moving Forward Act, which is a major reauthorization of the FAST Act. It does include a provision that would require the General Accountability Office to do a study on the effects of precision scheduled railroading, which is very, very important, especially considering there is no freight title in the FAST Act. There is a passenger rail title, but not a freight title. We also expect Senator Baldwin to introduce her Rail Shipper Fairness Act of 2021, and the STB reauthorization, it actually expired on September 30th, 2020. So hopefully within FAST Act and the Rail Shipper Fairness Act, and if we do happen to see the GAO do a study on PSR effects on its own, which members of Congress can request that on their own without having legislation. Maybe we'll have enough to have an STB reauthorization movement next year. So with the last slide, John, if you could go to slide 8, I thank you very much and more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ann. I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. Very, very detailed, and Ann's got her finger on the pulse for those things. It's a couple of things. It's funny. Ann mentioned that when Cedric Richmond from Louisiana left his House seat to join the Biden team as his director of congressional affairs, outreach, and so forth. Despite Nancy Pelosi wanting him to stick around, that's one of the examples where the progressive left's hair lit on fire, because Congressman Richmond is from Louisiana, and shock, he had taken campaign contributions from an oil company once or twice, so the reaction from the left was, how could you put such a person in such a position? Couple other, this is like fantasy baseball for political junkies like Ann and I, is figuring out, betting on who's going to be what. The latest rumor I heard for transportation secretary, in addition to Schwarzenegger, is Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti. There's lots of and of course he has the Green LA New Deal, the LA Green New Deal, that kind of thing. The other one, and I'll ask you this question, and Senator Duckworth is rumored as a potential Secretary of Veterans Affairs. What does that do to us if if we lose her with her sponsorship of the Rail Shipper Fairness Act and so forth?
I'm not sure who's next in line. Let me just double check. She has been, of course, more focused on passenger rail, but also has been helpful and has had a sympathetic ear to shippers. And the next in line would be, It's Amy Klobuchar again.
Well, that's as good or better, right?
It is just kind of good or better. And then after her is Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, and he's extremely interested on the shipper side, but his shipper interest is more from the paper industry and the chemical industry rather than coal.
Great. Anyone else have any questions? You can unmute yourself and join the conversation, or send a message in the chat box if there's anything that's come up that's interesting to you. Ann, have you heard any rumblings as to the whens on when some of these cabinet appointments are going to be moving forward?
Well, typically the cabinet appointments that are first are the ones that are in place on Inauguration Day, and that is typically Department of Defense, and so DoD Secretary, Department of State, so Defense, State, Homeland Security, and the non-cabinet levels would be like your National Security Officer. So those are typically the ones that are done first. So then that would mean that the current lame duck Congress would, or the new Congress in January would have to hold the confirmation. They would have to be nominated, and then the confirmation hearings would have to be held in the Senate committees.
It's been interesting to watch too. Biden has pretty much filled out his White House team now. I think I mentioned he picked Ron Klain for his chief of staff. The next two highest positions next to that are old hands. So far, at least as it pertains to the people he's going to surround himself with in the White House, Biden has been choosing people from his old team. You know, this has got some of the progressive wing upset as well. They were looking for more diverse representation, but at least in the early stages, Biden seems to be going back to what he knows and surrounding himself with trusted advisors who have been with him either when he served as vice president or when he served in the Senate. You agree with that?
Right, exactly. And you find that with the first 4 years of an administration, the personnel picks are more of that pedigree and background. People that have been, with the president for years, trusted inner circle people that, sacrificed almost everything for the campaign effort to help get the president elected. Then as you end your second term or end your first term, and then you have a reelection and you win again, your second term, that's when you generally see the personnel appointments being a little bit more out on a limb on policy initiatives. So they don't have the need or the obligation to repay those who have been, longtime supporters. So that would be, if he were to run again and there be a second term, that's when you would see, people appointed of a little bit more, I would think, more progressive policy ideals. I don't actually know what would happen if Biden becomes incapacitated and then we have Kamala Harris as president. That line of thought might be accelerated a bit.
Excellent. We got 3 minutes left. If anybody wants to jump in with a question or comment. I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to make an executive decision and be the only guy on the planet who ends a webinar 3 minutes early these days. So we appreciate everybody joining us this morning. I hope you found the discussion informative. If you want a copy of the slides, you can email me, john@movecoal.org, or they're also posted on our website under the positions papers section. There will also be a link to those in your on-track newsletter that comes out later on today. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and stay safe out there.
Thank you.